we go. All right, this should work. All right, so I'm hopefully going to talk to you about how IoT is accelerating science-based companies. And one of the things is that science is accelerating many of the things that we interact with on a daily basis. So what you may not realize or may not appreciate is everything you touch in the physical world is a product of some type of science-based endeavor. So it could be textiles, it could be material science, it could be pharmaceuticals, it's pills. Even the furniture that you sit on is a product of science in the sense that everything is paint, material science. Food that you eat, food science. Everything is a science-based endeavor. And what I'm here to talk to you about is how do we accelerate science-based work? So on one hand, if you're a venture capitalist or an angel investor and you want to invest into a science-based organization, it's full of risks. And so it's not like making a dating app like Tinder where it's very little capital goes in and you get a nice product out at the other end. But science-based companies require a lot of investment. So I'm from Boston, and biotech companies, they'll raise $40 million as their first round of investment. And most companies don't raise that much money through the entire process that they exist. And yet, if you're going to develop a drug, it's going to cost you tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. So the problem is investments in science are risky and it's full of unknowns. So most of you guys are in the tech field, so I'm sure you understand Moore's law. And for those of you who don't, what it's saying is that the processing power is growing exponentially on microprocessors, so that every year you can put more transistors onto your chip. So every year your computers are getting faster and faster and faster, and this has been happening for decades. So now, what you might not realize is in the biotech world, there's exactly the opposite. It's called Eroom's law, which is actually Moore's law spelled backwards. And Eroom's law says, as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to make drugs. And Eroom's law, let's see if this works. Eroom's law says that as the years go on, the amount of money that's needed to produce a single drug is growing. So that for every $1 billion that's invested into making a new drug, you get less and less out of the pipeline. So Eroom's law is just the opposite of Moore's law. And this is a great example of how science-based companies, pharmaceuticals, are slowing down. And we think that's a problem. So let me tell you a story about a mouse. So I had a friend who works in a big pharmaceutical company. And for those of you who understand how pharma and drug development works, every drug, before it goes into a human being, goes into a mouse as part of the study. Now, for about 6 months, the mice that they were studying were not reacting properly. They were not responding well to the different drugs that they were trying out. And test after test after test, the mice were not getting any better. And so, usually that happens. It's hard to find a drug. But in this particular case, one of the researchers looked back and he said, wait a second. The mice were actually being kept awake after hours because the room next door was being renovated, and the construction workers were doing all the construction work after hours so that the mice would not be disturbed. Oh, I'm sorry, so that the workers would not be disturbed. But what happened was the mice were disturbed. They didn't get any sleep at night. So you basically had chronically sleep-deprived mice, and their cortisol levels were through the roof. And so they had a artificially induced stress response. So what this means is the cure for cancer could have been lost because there was too much noise happening next door. And you think about things like this, and there's so many examples of what I would say silly things causing problems and delays in very complex science-based organizations. So doing science is very similar to writing code. When you're in a laboratory or when you're in manufacturing, you follow a procedure and a protocol. It's very much like baking a cake. I mean, how many of you guys have followed a recipe? You follow a recipe, bake a cake, and supposedly you should get the cake out. Well, when things go wrong, how do you find out what happens? Well, it's very similar to writing software. When things go wrong in code, you have tools like debuggers. Code is nothing more than a set of procedures and steps that you need to follow that the machine executes. But when things go wrong, Developers have these kinds of tools. But scientists don't have these tools. And in science, debugging is a lot harder. So much like baking a cake, if each of us took home the same recipe for chocolate cake and we came back tomorrow, we'll probably have dozens of different, slightly different types of cakes, even though we followed the same procedure and if we followed the same recipe. Now, in cooking, it's okay, but when you're making a drug, that's not okay. And it's because there's slight variations. My oven might be different than your oven, and my 30 minutes might be 32 minutes in the oven, and yours might be 28. But even though we follow the same steps, the results can be different. And that's the problem with science. If you compare how science relates to software, in software, your operating system is iOS or Mac or Windows or whatever, but in science-based industries, the physical world is your operating system, because every time you do an experiment, every time you test something on a mouse, or every time you sequence a genome, the physical world changes. And what I mean by that is, what machine did you use? When did you last calibrate it? When was it last serviced? When was it last fixed? And when you do your work, when you're trying to make this drug today, and you tried it again in 1 week, were the conditions the same? You know, you try to make a cake in the summer, try to make a cake in the winter, you could get different results. And finding the root cause of that is actually very difficult. And most importantly, where did you store your ingredients? And this is the most complex thing about doing science, is everything is based on physical properties. So, taking the analogy of the cake a little bit further, did you use fresh milk? Did you use fresh eggs? How do you know that they were actually transported and stored properly? When something goes wrong with your final product, there's a million things that could have caused why it went wrong. And finding that is actually really hard, and that takes lots and lots of time. So the thing is, we have state-of-the-art labs. I mean, pharma companies invest millions of dollars into R&D. But the problem is, very little of the scientific work is actually connected to the cloud. And you think about it, everything else, we live in a very connected world. Shouldn't our drug discovery also be connected? We already have smart homes. And that's what we're doing. We're building smart labs and smart factories and being able to connect what happens in the biological world, synthetic biology, to the cloud. I want to end this by giving you a couple of examples of some really innovative companies. There's a company out in San Francisco called Emerald Cloud Labs, and it's basically Amazon for science, AWS for science. And they have robotic labs. So they have a whole warehouse full of mass specs, NMR machines, gene sequencers, DNA synthesizers, you name it. They have everything. And you know what you do? You go to their website, you code up your experiment, and the robots execute it. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? Because it takes the human error out of it. So every time you bake a cake, you are absolutely guaranteed that the same cake is coming out. And it's the first cloud-connected laboratory in the entire world. There's another company also in the Bay Area called Viome. And this goes back to the story I told you about the mouse. They have a digital mouse lab. And like I mentioned, every single drug has to go through mouse tests. So what they do is they have dozens of sensors. They collect terabytes of data on mice, how much they sleep, how much they walk around, which direction is their nose pointed, how often they feed. Every single thing is captured so that when something goes wrong, you have a very data-rich repository where you can go through and debug what may have happened. And these are two examples of how IoT connected devices and cloud computing are being applied to drug discovery and science and research. Because without investments in this area, we're basically left trying to figure out what went wrong with our cake and just doing it over and over and over until it actually works. So I'd like to leave you with the idea that IoT makes debugging science a lot easier. And this is one of the last areas for connectivity and cloud computing. And with that, I think I actually made it through this presentation, finally. So thank you very much for your time.